Oh, does that mean it's on? There, now it's on. Excellent. Now we're way happier. Okay, we're going to continue looking at some of the... We actually didn't start on the 10 qualities of Christian leaders because we were doing other stuff and never got around to it. So we're going to skip some sections here. I'll tell you what we're skipping so you know, but most of you won't care. And as I just found out, Mary told me up in the personality thing, I won't care that you don't care. And that's completely true. I am a free man. There's an awful lot I don't care about. So, you're on this thing, and we got to sort of Christian leaders or servant leaders, and then there's a slide in the middle on page 7 that says, does servant leadership... Sorry. There. He keeps trying to touch me.
I like you. He's a blue.
Yeah. The people I work with are mean-spirited, and they're aware that like touching is not that good. Like, I want my personal space. Like, stay out of my way. So we were doing an ordination. Ordination is like a really serious thing, and we were doing it in a Korean church. Korean churches are, if you think of ordination as serious, and then you take a Korean church and the formality of it, it goes to like a hyper, it's like formality on steroids. And so in our churches, we do an ordination. It's a long story anyway. You go through testing the theology of people and all that stuff, and they decide to get reverend in front of their name. And when you do it, normally the church does the ordaining, and so people gather around, lay hands on them, and pray for them, and all that. And it's a great thing and a serious thing. In a Korean church, it's extreme. So I was doing an ordination in it because of my job title, not because of me as a person. Me as a person was irrelevant to it totally. Regional Director of Fellowship Pacific mattered to them because of the formality of the position. They video it and send the video back to Korea. So we have about 10 Korean churches as part of the Fellowship Pacific. And they had 5 guys that were getting ordained as pastors. And so when they come in and they're in the full suits, nice, and they kneel at the front. And so there was myself, there was 2 other of my co-workers from our office that were there, and they felt that part of this ceremony, you had to be robed like you were in an academic institution doing a graduation. So they came out, part of it was the robing ceremony of the Fellowship Pacific staff as part of the thing for it. So they came out, and the 2 that were with me got like black, velvet things with little hats, and they had to put them on with them. And then they came out, and mine was like red with red, orange velvet stripes and pretty much a hat, and had to put on white gloves. And it's like, I'm like, no. But you can't really say that in the Korean church, because for them this is like very important. Just a totally different culture to it. And so we do all that, and then we're laying hands on these people to pray for them, and I have to do the ordination prayer because that's really important in the formality of the situation. So my one coworker, as soon as I started to pray, starts rubbing my back and turned the prayer from behind me in front of this like 400 Koreans, and he just up and down my back, very mean-spirited. Because one false word there, I get fired, and the whole thing goes down the tubes, and the Koreans leave the fellowship church, and they possibly spend eternity in hell. It's a terrible thing. So that's inappropriate touching at an inappropriate time. But I digress. Strike that from the video. Get that off the video. We're moving on. So the part we're skipping is the stuff about styles and influence. We'll talk about influence a little bit. This is just a bit of history. If you guys aren't into sort of management history at all, and styles and influence and leadership, it's sort of interesting to hear, sort of not, because what we look at today, a lot of what we look at today actually comes from Japan, and there was a thing called Theory X and Theory Y, different views of people, which affected how management styles operate, all that kind of stuff. We're skipping all that because you don't care. How about it? We also have a little section in here about levels of leadership, 5 levels of leadership, which is from John Maxwell. That's worth your looking at and reading about and talking about what kinds of levels of leadership there are that's range from position at the bottom through to personhood at the top. And so the bottom level of leadership, according to John Maxwell, is position, that is leadership that you have because of your title. So if you lead because you're, in a church setting, you're the pastor, so you're the leader. If that's the reason, it's a bad reason. Very limited level of leadership, and it talks about moving your way up that till you get to the point at the top where you have respect for who you are and what you represent, and that being kind of the top level of leadership. And it's important to think some of those things through, because typically in churches we still, to some degree, think of it in terms of position. And actually some of the conversations in churches, again, and the crises that I end up dealing with have to do with titles in churches. And so people, sometimes staffs even get into little arguments about what the title of their staff is. So is lead pastor a good title? Should it be senior pastor? What about associate pastor or assistant pastor? And all these old titles that they had, they get very hung up on that kind of stuff. So when I was pastoring, we had another pastor on staff whose title was, when he first got hired, was assistant pastor, but he wanted to be the associate pastor, and it was a big deal for him, and he sent letters to the board and all that kind of stuff, and it was very irritating overall, because who really cares, you know, what the title is. So in one of our annual meetings, I just, you know how you do your budgets. I don't know how you do your budgets. At that time, in the budgets, it had like senior pastor listed the different staff names and, you know, salaries as part of the overall budget. So we just switched, we being me, that's a royal we, switched all the titles from, you know, pastor, preaching pastor, all those different titles, to peon of discipleship, peon of preaching, peon, minions. There were some minions, some peons, and some lackeys. That's where the three titles, all in our budget. Took actually 3 years before anybody even noticed, which tells me everything I needed to know about our budget process and about titles and how much titles matter. But at the bottom level of leadership is position, title-based kind of leadership, and you do want to move up that. But we're not even talking about that. That was just another fun-filled extra story. We're going on to 10 qualities of a Christian leader. And we have about an hour to do it. Skip. Okay, so think of leaders that you've known, that you've really respected or appreciated and followed and been willing to follow, and what were the characteristics of those people? What are some of those things that leap to mind for you? Don't look ahead, because that's called cheating, which would mean you violate the integrity one, which is one of the ones in here. Integrity. Right there, you failed. So, wisdom.
Respect for subordinates.
Sorry.
Respect for subordinates.
Okay, respect for people, subordinates. Yep. Charisma. Gentleness. Forthright.
Ability to communicate.
Ability to communicate. Expertise. Yeah, all of those things come into play. And so when you start looking at this, you know, one of the first ones that comes to mind for people and have in numerous tests for a long time are characteristics of a Christian leader. The first one we're talking about is he leads by example. And the descriptors of that in that little leadership quotient inventory that's in there that you can take if you want to, there's like a half-page descriptor of what it means to lead by example, at least the description that I'm using for it, because you'd get other ones as well from other people. And when you start looking at leadership, one of the things that most people would look at and say is, I'll follow a leader who does what they say others should do. That is, they live with some process of integrity in their own life, and what they do, whatever they ask others to do, they're willing to do themselves in their own life. So they lead by example. So journalists, for example, would look at source credibility, and do you have any journalists here? So journalists, when they start asking, is the source credible enough that you could use it in a newspaper, for example, they have 3 different foundations for it, which are trustworthy, some expertise, and dynamism as 3 elements of source credibility. When you start looking at books and research by guys like Houses and Posner, I don't know how you pronounce his name. Anyway, I pronounce it wrong. I know that because I get corrected every time. So I know it's not Posner, but that's just what I'm going to go with, because it's what flows out. In their book, Leadership Challenge, which is a foundational kind of leadership book that you'd get in almost any course you do it, they'd say the top 4 characteristics of admired leaders are honest, forward-looking, inspiring, and competent. Those are the top 4 that when you start asking, and they did studies of thousands of people, companies, nonprofits, everything, asking them that exact question, what are the characteristics of leaders that you're willing to follow? Top 4 things, honest was number 1 in virtually every single study. So 99% ethics, 99% of people said ethics was number 1 thing, that they were honest. Second thing, 98% said was forward-looking, that is ability to articulate direction for 5 months or 5 years. They didn't really care what the time period was, but if they couldn't articulate anything about the future, they didn't trust them. Third thing was inspiring, which goes to that question of charisma, whether it should or shouldn't, but still 91% of executives said that some kind of inspirational level mattered for them in leadership, and 4 is competent. So in fact, when we start talking about trust of people, often in a church, and maybe sometimes elsewhere in a church, we say, do we trust someone? Let's say, well, in any front. Do we trust them? And normally when we think of do we trust them, we're talking about character. Like, do they have an honorable character? Do they have integrity? Do they have that? The truth is that when you talk about trust for somebody, there's 2 sides to trust. One of them is character. What's the other side? There's a hint because it's the 4th thing listed up on the screen. Competence. Exactly. There's character and there's competence. So I could trust your character completely, that what you say you want to do, you actually want to do, that you care about it, you're vitally interested, you want to see it happen. It doesn't mean you have the capability or the competence to actually do it. So sometimes you'd say to somebody, I can't trust you to do that, and they'd go, well, you can't say you don't trust me because you're saying I'm a bad person and I'm untrustworthy and all that kind of stuff. No, I'm saying you're incompetent. It's way better. You see how that goes? That's a much better way of doing it. It'd be like saying, David, we would like you to lead singing tomorrow morning at our church. You could trust me to want to lead singing in your church. You could trust me to want to be a great worship leader at church. You could trust me to pick some great songs. You couldn't trust me to hold a tune for 2 seconds. Because the truth is, I literally cannot sing and clap at the same time. And that's not a joke, that's actually true. And so when I was pastoring a church, I'd sit in the front row in the services, and if I clapped, they'd get mad, the worship leaders. Like, you have to, lead by example. So you have to sing. Okay, what do you want me to do, sing or clap? Because you can't have both. You really can't have both. Because I can watch you clapping, and I can do it. Or I can sing along with you, but I can't sing and clap at the same time. So do you want me to lead your worship? No, because I'm not competent. And competent may, sometimes it's because you didn't study to learn it. Sometimes it's just you're not gifted at it. You can't do it. And so when we're talking about competence in here, it matters to people. And we don't like it in church. We rarely say it. In fact, I don't know if we ever say it that forthright. We, lie like the Dickens to avoid saying to somebody, you're incompetent. What? I'm sorry. Is it not true that sometimes we're incompetent? We just can't do it. That doesn't need to be a pejorative statement. It's just a reality. Sometimes we're not good at something. That's the way it is. And so you'll get people who want to be worship leaders who can't sing. You get people who want to work with, you don't want me to work with your 2-year-olds either. For the same, there's a whole long list of things I'm incompetent at. And you don't want. So when you're looking at leaders, a leader leads by example. Top 4 characteristics: honest, forward-looking, inspiring, competent. They all matter. And with that comes the idea of credibility, and whole books written on the idea of credibility. So when we say that people who are good leaders lead by example, that means they're trying to build human collateral. Human collateral is credibility with people, where people look at you and they say, what you're asking for, you're willing to do. You're a credible leader. And credibility becomes a really big point. So here's some of the things about credibility. Credibility is rooted in the past. So you don't get credibility given to you. Generally speaking, if you get into a leadership position, you get like a little bit of free credibility. It's like a product. Here, you get like 10 credibility units to play with, which you can spend however you want. Ideally, as a leader, you want to keep building up your pool of credibility units. But you can also spend your credibility units by making terrible judgment calls, doing a bad leadership. Once you start losing them all, you have like a little window after which you're bankrupt. And if you're bankrupt in credibility, you're dead as a leader. That's a reality. So it's rooted in the past, in the sense that people who have seen you over time give lots more credibility units to you if you've demonstrated that over a long period. Does that make some sense to you? Credibility is earned over time. So that's the same idea. You can build into that credibility bank account over time. It doesn't just come with the job. Although, again, as I said, you usually get a little bit going into that job, so people have some grace for it. Third, the wider and deeper the vision, the deeper the foundation of credibility must be. So the more you're asking of people, So if you're trying as a leader to sell a vision of the future of some sort, what God's calling you to as a church or in ministry, whatever it may be, the deeper and more significant the change, the more credibility you have to have in your account. Because the more you're going to spend. The minute you ask for change, you're spending your credibility. And you're going to have enough to get you over the hump. And your credibility account is going to drop like this. And so you're hoping there's a few coins of credibility left in it by the time you've gone through that significant change. But if they don't start to see results coming out the other end, you end up being bankrupt again. So just understand that when you're looking at leading by example as a leader, you're building that and spending that all the time. And if you're aware, or as Mary would say, if you're green, that is, you're an analyst in how you approach life, you're quite aware of what you're doing. You're quite aware of when you're spending it and when you're getting it. And you're also aware of where your bank account sits at any given moment and the danger level of the steps you're taking. So you're aware, that's why in some things when you're starting to bring about change and your credibility level is low and you've got a little bit left, you know that you need early wins, because early wins will do what? They will build your credibility account. Early losses will do what? Exactly the same thing. If you know you've got a backlog of credibility, you can do some really dumb things and get away with them. You can also get trusted in some things you should never get trusted in because of that. I remember in the church I was in, and I was there 18 years, so there's a long period of history of credibility earned over time. We got sued for $6 million. This is where credibility was not good. And our board's perspective, this was the summary of it. I was shaken to the core over being, because I was named on it, of course, on being sued for $6 million. Scared the daylights out of me. This is our board. Oh, well, deal with it, David. Next. That was their whole agenda conversation. It's like, what? Well, you can deal with it. Like, no! So that was credibility run amok. That was my opinion on that. That was like, actually, I don't want that much credibility in my account, and I don't want to do this myself, and I'm now going to spend credibility to tell you I don't want to do this myself. I have no interest in doing it. But sometimes you can get enough over time that you can go through some gigantic mistakes, and it's okay. We get it. You're spending a bunch, but we can go with it. So, number 4, credibility is based on what you say, doing what you say you will do. For leaders, it's based even more on doing what we say we will do. So as a person who wants integrity, and we'll come back to the idea of integrity, doing what you say you will do matters. As a leader, it's more than that. You have to do what we say we will do. So you have to live out what you say, even if sometimes that means you have to burn some credibility points to get it, to prove that your leading by example is real and you're doing what we do, even if at points that starts to shake the values because it's about change. So on whatever front that may be. So again, church world, for us to say get involved in community is easy. If you do that as a pastor, you better ask, where am I getting involved in the community? It's not much more complicated than that. Do what we say we will do. So I coached baseball for 20 years. I could use baseball as an illustration, never-ending illustration. I still can, still do, still love to, because baseball is God's gift to the world. So easy for me to do it. But to do it also allows me to talk about community involvement. What are you doing? It meant I would take some vacation days and vacation weekends to go to tournaments, to do things with kids in the community that aren't my kids, all that kind of stuff. It's about not just about doing what you love, which hopefully it is, but it's doing what we say we will do. And leaders really have to. That's why when you get in, I don't know what's true in your church, so I'm not taking a shot at anybody, if this happened to be a shot at anybody, just saying. When you start to say that small groups are critical to our church, and then in many of the churches I go to, you ask on the board members, okay, do you all go to a board? Go to a small group? No. Like, no? What do you mean no? How can it be no? The answer can't be no. Because it can't be no, not if you want credibility. If you actually want to see people in your church to do the things that we say we will do, then you have to do the things that we say we will do. Otherwise, there's no credibility to the claim you're making. And so in leadership, when you talk about this, whether it's Christian leaders or not, but Christian leaders in particular, we do what we say we will do. So some of the practices of credibility builders, things like, and it would be in book which is titled Credibility, very difficult to remember. Appreciate the stakeholders, affirm shared values, develop capacity of others, serve a purpose, sustain hope, all those kinds of things. So there's a whole science and studies behind the concept of this. But leading by example, in the end of the day, doing what we say we will do, building credibility. Really important, significant thing. That's one. We got 9 more to go. Any comments on that? It'd be good if there's comments, because we got 50 minutes to go, and I'll be super bored if you just stare at me. Any examples of really credible leaders you followed, or really not credible leaders that you've experienced?
No, remember?
In which way? You want to specify?
Well, I mean, anything that he says he's going to do, if it comes out of his mouth, he will make sure that it gets done, because he understands the credibility thing. And I had him sit down in a coffee shop one time and explain it as, like, you go into a place with your pocket with a certain amount of credibility change. And if you say you're going to do something, you better stick and do it. Even if you don't want to, and even if it fails, it's still better that you did it rather than not doing it at all. If you say you're going to do it,
Yeah, unless it's super stupid.
yeah.
In which point you stand up and acknowledge that it was a stupid idea.
Stupid, so.
So your credibility just plummeted. So, okay.
I was just thinking, is it possible to have a medical leader that doesn't have much credibility? But I think people get sucked into a lot of bad things when they try to make leaders. And they keep drawing and gathering because they're so charismatic.
Yeah, they do, but it's a danger and it's waiting to explode. So let me give you one clear, obvious example in the church world, Western church world. What would be the best example of the last 5 years? Give me a name. Mars Hill. Right? Guy who started with credibility in certain levels, grew a church to 10,000 plus people, multiple campuses, all that kind of stuff, and it just blew apart. It doesn't even exist anymore. Took, 3 months to blow up when the credibility got shattered. So I think you can gather people by a perceived credibility, but when reality kicks in about what that is and it blows up, people won't stick around. And you're in deep trouble eventually.
Or turns into a cult.
It could turn into a cult, that's true, but you're still in deep trouble, I think, if that's the case. Okay, so second thing. First one, leads by example. Second one, enables others to grow and develop. This is a quote from Bill Hull in his book, The Disciple-Making Pastor. He says, I've thrown down the gauntlet. I maintain that the evangelical church is weak, self-indulgent, and superficial, that it's been thoroughly discipled by its culture. I like that little statement, been thoroughly discipled by its culture. As Jesus said, when a disciple has been fully taught, he will be like his teacher. Furthermore, I believe the crisis of the church is one of product, the kind of people being produced. I propose the solution to be obedience to Christ's commission to make disciples. Bottom line, he's saying that churches aren't making disciples today, and they've forgotten what they're there to do, and they're no longer given the product they need to, which is people obedient to Christ. So a person who is a Christian leader enables others to develop, to grow. I hope that's true. So when we're talking about that within the church, we're saying that enabling others is the intentional application of discipleship to life. It's really not much more complicated than that. And so that happens through a bunch of things like individual discipling, mentoring, church programming, creation of appropriate cultures. So you're trying to help others to grow. And it's not really rocket science. It's an Ephesians 4 kind of thing. Who remembers what Ephesians 4 says about the job of leaders in a church?
Equip the saints.
Yeah, equip the saints to do the work of ministry. So both churches and pastors get confused in it regularly, where they think that the job is for the pastors to do the work of ministry, which it's not. And particularly in a growing church, the point is to have the church grow by the people developing. And the people grow. So you're always asking, how do we help the people to grow, to develop, to become more like Christ, to release them into ministry? And a church that really explodes in growth is a church that really develops leaders who then start to develop other leaders. So you have a multiplying effect that takes place in terms of the development of people and releasing of people into ministry. If we don't do that, then we're not really doing what Christ has called us to as leaders in the Church of Jesus Christ. So you can have a pastor who gets up, is a great preacher, does that well, does a lot of things really well, but the church is limited to the capacity of that person, And worse than that, it's not doing what a church should be doing, which is growing people. When we talked about that a little bit last night in Sparrow, about that whole idea for us that the church is filled with messed up people, that's true. And our job is to see them travel down this sort of journey where they're different than when they came in. So a lot of it starts to look at what do you think of when you think of church. And an illustration, which I think I've used here actually with your church before, probably a few years ago, is whether you think of church as a river or as a lake. And the metaphor for me works very well because it keeps my mind thinking about it. So we often come to a church and we think of it like a lake, like it's a resort we get to. That when we've arrived, we're now here and we have a healthy, good church. And this is what we talked about, the fact that church is never healthy and good. It's always messed up because it's always filled with messed up people. If we do our job of reaching lost people in our community, they're coming in, they're screwed up in so many different ways, and so are we, and we get in and it creates conflicts, all kinds of things. But somehow we have this idea in our mind that we need to get to that place. When we get a good church, we're going to be at the lake. You understand what I'm saying? And that's not what we are. We're a river. We're about movement. So somebody, if you think of it like a river coming right here, someone might come into the church and they come right out of your community and they have a background in addictions, issues in their family, all kinds of stuff coming in. And they've never heard anything about Christianity. They don't really know anything about it. And so they come in the river right here. And if 5 years down the road we've worked with them, we've discipled them, they've gotten out of a life of addictions, their marriage is in decent shape, but they still got a lot of things to learn. But they're no longer here, they're here. Is that success? Yeah. Of course that's success. Are they at the lake? No, they may not be at the lake ever. In fact, they're never going to be at the lake, because where's the lake? Heaven. That's it. But somebody else comes along into it. So let's say I came into your church, moved to Fernie, came to your church, and here's a guy who's been involved in church ministry of sorts for 25 years, who's taught in a Bible school, done all that kind of stuff. Now, still messed up, still got problems, still got the same thing, but I'm not coming in here. I'm not coming in with the really foundational bottom line life issues I better deal with right away, like addictions and my marriage is pretty solid, all that stuff's happening. So I'm coming in here. Am I better than this person? In any way? Am I better? No. So if 5 years down the road I'm here, is that success? No, it's still failure. Because it isn't where I came in, it's how far did I move? Did I grow? And in fact, the reality is the longer you go into Christian life, every step of growth becomes harder, not easier, in my opinion. So now you can question that, and I think you'd have some really good reasons to question that. So if you have a person coming in with a background of addictions, they've got to deal with addictions. There's a sense in which that's super, super hard, of course. But there's a sense where it's obvious as well. We got to deal with this. It's clear, it's straightforward. We know what it is. It's going to be hard to do, but we know what it is. The person who comes in over here has got to deal with some core level internal issues about confession, about sin, that they don't even want to look at, that they can live with the false impression of having arrived at the lake, but they haven't. So it's way harder sometimes because the steps here are more difficult internally than they are here. Although externally this is way harder. All of which is to say, when we think of church and developing people, we're thinking not of lake, we're thinking of river. Movement is the point. Success is taking the person wherever they come into that river and helping them grow. If we can do that, we're succeeding. And a Christian leader is going to do that. They're going to enable others to grow and to develop. So think of some of the people who most influence you as a leader. So this is the next slide in here. Yeah. How did they do it? What are some of the stories when you look back and you think of part of your journey? What would that be? I'll give you a simple example for myself. Won't be your story necessarily. I had a guy, died recently actually, Matt. Just so you know, everybody I know dies. It's part of every story. Somebody died. But this is long before he died. So when I was a kid, I was in Victoria. He came along and said to me, "So, David, we're doing a church service." I was in Victoria, in Parksville, in 2 weeks, and you're speaking at it. And I was 15. I was like, "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." Like, "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." It's already decided. We already told them and walked away. I did nothing, and he also did nothing to help me, by the way. Let me also add, figure out what that actually means or looks like. He gets there, we're at this service, and he gets up, oh, David's now going to speak to you. I said I'm not going to. I said you were, and he sat back down. Felt total peer pressure, got up and did, I won't say it was a sermon because that would be like a really, really big exaggeration. It was more like turmoil. I did a turmoil. And at the end, this little old lady came up and grabbed it. She, you were so cute. Anyway, hated him completely. But if I look in him, and he did that repeatedly for it, he said, why? Because God's called you into ministry. You have to start preparing. I kind of felt he had to help me, but that was beside the point. I can look at his story in my life, and I think where I am now, significant part of it, where a person who was insisting that I was going to grow and develop whether I wanted to or not. Now, I'm not advocating his process at all. On the other hand, he cared and did something about it. So what about your stories? Can you think of some people that helped you to grow and develop?
Well, my boss at work, a great boss. Part of that being great is being very critical of others in order to help me grow. And so I use that a lot, not just focusing on what other things we do, but finding the weak spot.
Yeah. People help us. What else?
Affirmation is pretty huge. You know, when you have somebody that you respect, and people that I respect because they are very competent or strong in certain ways, and then when they affirm those things in me, then that's very influential.
Yeah, one of the interesting things for me in church is that this guy didn't have like a formal leadership, the guy that I'm referring to, leadership role over me. He just kept influencing a group of people. And so there was 4 men in the church I was in. They took us camping all the time. They would set up these little services. They did stuff. There was no program in the church for it. They weren't part of the official structure of anything. They just did that. They'd say, hey, we're going camping, the 4 of us. Any of you want to go camping? There was like a group of about 10 of us that were young men in the church, boys. They'd say, hey, any of you want to come with us? And we'd get there and they'd say, okay, we're at that end of the campsite. Don't come there unless you need us. And they leave us the other end. But out of that group of 10, 5 of those guys are pastors in churches. And I think, so what happened? It was 4 or 5 years of men investing in our lives, not through a program, but because they did what Matt's saying. They encouraged, they supported, they were there, they pushed. They did a lot of different things. It's interesting just to see how God uses people. But leaders in the church do that. And you ought to be thinking about your own stories and appreciating it. Sort of goes to the TED Talk. They remember the people that have made a difference in your life. Don't take them for granted. And then ask, who are you doing that for? And so I think of that man frequently in my own life when I start thinking about who am I investing in? How do I see them grow? What am I doing for them? How do I do that? So you can look at this biblically as well. We don't have time to go through this in detail in this next little thing. How discipleship helps people grow and how discipleship and developing other leaders actually happens. And so there's a little cycle in there. You can look at this from the life of Timothy. That would just be for me reading through 1st and 2nd Timothy a few times and asking, okay, what do I see? Because Timothy was a person who was mentored by Paul. And you see at the beginning where Paul reminds Timothy to how he started his life, and his mother and grandmother invested in his life, and then he invested in him and all that stuff. And it's actually quite an interesting story, from knowing God to learning, sharing, serving, sacrificing, and reproducing, kind of a whole discipleship cycle that's worth paying attention to at some point, or doing a small group study on, or doing something with relative to leadership. We don't have time to look at all that today, so we're going to move on to the next part of that in terms of enabling others to grow and develop. It's important to know that corporate culture is as important as individual training. So when we're talking about developing people, you get the flavor of the development isn't just by individuals who do it in your life, it's the corporate culture that you create in a church. It's the sense of who you are, what you do that matters. Culture adds flavor to everything. And you can create a culture in which this is part of your normal process, or you can have a culture in which it's never part of your process. So what would be the difference in a church between a culture that develops and trains and equips people and one that doesn't? What are some of the things? What would the differences be?
The leaders just
Absolutely. For example.
An example of that.
Yep.
It's only the pastors praying from the front. It's only the pastors preaching. It's only the pastors contributing ideas in a group setting to where you will go.
Right. So that would be really important. So some of the things that you might do, and I'm not saying you need to do them, but for example, let's use the preaching example. Normally in churches are pretty nasty when it comes to preaching. If the preaching is bad, they leave. It's the bottom line. So pastors, maybe more so than any time I can remember, at least in my history today, don't bring in people. They don't used to be that you'd let young people do sermons. You know, you'd have them, that's where they'd stick me up in front at 15, and they'd come up and say, no one was mad that I didn't know what I was doing and did a turmoil instead of a sermon. Nobody cared. They just had sort of, oh, that's interesting. It's really sad for that guy. He has no future. Anyway, that's how it went. So I remember before I turned 17, had spoken 3 times in churches, including Central Baptist in Victoria, which was about 700 people at the time. Terrible sermons. One of them I didn't make it through. I started to laugh and I left. That's because I was talking about self-control and started talking about how much beer you could drink before you lost control. Then, I'm not saying that you're drinking beer. Maybe you're drinking beer, but I shouldn't be saying if you're drinking beer. I'm not saying I'm drinking beer. Anyway, I just started laughing and left. Anyway, but they invested in it. If we do some of that stuff in churches, and if we took the next step as well, which is, okay, we let this person, let's just say that was the case, we let this person speak. And then the next week you were to say, this is what they learned. It's not just the speaking, but it's the culture of learning, of developing, and saying, and not only is it okay for us to do this, it's okay for us to actually sit and critique it. It's okay for us to talk about what did we learn, what are we growing from as a church and as the individual. What did he learn? How do we contribute to his life? And even if you only did that once a year, maybe that starts to set a culture. All I'm saying is the culture you create in your church right across the board affects whether or not this is true or not. It's not just as simple as did one person do this with somebody else. So we talk about mentoring, which is critically important, but I think there is a church mentoring element to it, which is what is the flavor we've created in our church? Do we believe we let people step up and fail? Do we not? All those kinds of things.
I was going to say one thing, big difference in the 2 different cultures there would be people that go to a church where there's leadership development going on and stuff in different opportunities, they know that there's a next step that they can take. Right? And so if you know that there's stuff that you could get plugged into, opportunities where you could make a step into leadership or developing, or where that opportunity is available, it's a completely different feeling than if you're just attending on Sunday and you don't really know what's going on, and you don't really know your purpose, or you're not really sure where you can get plugged in. It's just kind of unknown.
You have to know the steps. Yeah. And you also need to know the code. And so, if I flip back to sports for a second, or baseball, there's a code in baseball. If you guys watched any of the Blue Jays stuff in the last series when Jose Bautista threw his bat, and then there was he violated the code. Hockey has the code. There's the laws, and then there's the unwritten laws. The fact of the matter is everywhere has them. Church has them. The laws and the unwritten laws. You have to ask, what is the unwritten laws you're creating as well about what we do and what we don't do? What's the code, if you will? And what is that kind of code that we're creating? So again, Central that I grew up in did some things really, really well. Some things that didn't do as well is you were never on the board at that church if you didn't have doctor in front of your name. Ever. Now that's different now, but it's 25 years later. When I grew up, it was like, okay, forget it. If you're not like a doctor, or particularly if you didn't teach at a university, forget it. Never going to happen. It was the code. When people got elected, really there was no election. Everybody knew there was no election because there was a code, and that was the code. So we're always teaching that stuff. Got to remember that in culture when we start talking about Christian leadership and enabling others to grow and develop. What's the code we're creating? Okay, number 3. I think. Okay, I'm at number 3. Are you at number 3? Yeah, there we go. Attracts and influences people. So leads by example, enables others to grow and develop. Number 3, attracts and influences people. So charisma is the ability to get other people to endorse your vision and promote it passionately. It lifts the whole team's level of play. Number 1 managerial productivity problem in America is quite simply managers who are out of touch with their people, out of touch with their customers. It's Tom Peters in A Passion for Excellence, in which he lied about all his data, just so you know. So, Harry Overstreet, the very essence of all power to influence lies in getting the other person to participate. Next slide. So, like it or not, a leader is defined by their crowd and by the movement of their crowd. Is that valid or not valid?
Not always valid.
Way to put a qualifier in there.
Well, I mean, if you're standing up for what's right, you're moving against the crowd. The crowd might not be moving with you, right? But you're taking the right leadership, for example.
Okay, does that make that, so couldn't that still work here? Maybe your crowd is a crowd of two.
Maybe you
And the movement of your
maybe
crowd
you
is
don't have
opposed to,
anyone- Maybe you don't have anyone following you, but you did the right thing, in which case that statement doesn't
Well, you
cover that.
are no longer a leader then.
Yeah, you're just leaving yourself in control.
I would say it's
No,
not
no,
valid.
because that's what I'm saying, is that's why that definition doesn't cut it in its fullness, because leadership is stepping out in faith, and if no one follows, but you've got to live by those convictions.
yeah, unless you were wrong, of course.
Like Jesus led, but it wasn't, no, but Jesus led, and he went to the cross, but there wasn't his disciples with him on the cross while he died, and in that sense, there wasn't that movement that they were right there with him, so by that definition, I wouldn't see that as cutting it, and yet Jesus was probably the greatest leader that ever walked the earth.
Yeah. How old are you?
How old am I?
Yeah.
30.
30, okay. You're like 4 years ahead of my oldest son, who've already learned that the answer to every question is Jesus.
Yeah.
So you just threw it in my face. When in doubt, if you want to take a counterculture position, Jesus. There's your answer. Okay, what else? We have one valid, we have not always valid.
I'd say it's valid because the crowd is the fruit.
The crowd is a fruit? Is that what you just said?
Yeah, like when you're leading and whoever's following, that's the fruit that you're bearing, right? Like that is basically the proof of what it is that you're doing. The people that are following.
Yeah, in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anything else? Anybody else want to kick in? Valid, invalid? Generally speaking, with some exceptions, because even I think in most exceptions, the crowd might be really small that's following you, but the people that are following you are not like the rest, and it's still defining you a little bit. You know, and so it's who gathers around you makes a fairly big difference, and somewhat. I think it's mostly valid, but maybe occasionally not. See Jesus. So moving on. Fact number 1. Leaders attract people. So the basic rule of this is we attract who we are, not what we want. That's a fairly important thing in a leadership thing when we start talking about attracting and influencing people. You get who you are, not just what you want. So whether or not you want a different kind of people, you tend to gather the people around you that are most like you. That's typically what happens. There are, again, exceptions to that, but as a basic rule, that's true. So when you look in churches and you ask who comes to our church, generally pastors get people that are more like them. Generally boards become people that are more like them. Not always, there's lots of exceptions to it, but as a general rule, that typically happens. We attract who we are and not what we want. The corollary to that is that if you think you're leading and nobody's following, you're just taking a walk. If nobody comes after you, then you're not really doing too much to lead people. So what are some of the factors that actually attract people? Well, here's one: appearance. Say, for example, if you were a national leader and had good hair. You laugh. I saw all kinds of polls and discussions of how many people were going to vote for Trudeau because of his hair. And numerous people said, well, I think he's cute. I wasn't one of them, but Ryan possibly. So, appearance makes a difference. There's just no avoiding that reality. Leaders who give a sense of belonging, leaders who have confidence, exude confidence, leaders who are enthusiastic. Significance attracts leaders. So that's a particular one in the sense that who do you attract? If you are calling people to something significant, then leaders will come. If you're not, they don't. Someone who wants to actually do something gets very frustrated in a scenario where the person who is the leader isn't actually trying to go towards something that has significant meaning. And people will give a lot. They will give a lot of who they are to something that matters. But they won't give it to nobody. So I find it interesting in today's culture, for example, in church culture particularly, people talk all the time about whether we're in church counterculture time when people hate tolerance in Canadian environment is so big as our highest value when you start asking about polling people about the highest values of Canadians. And so that it's a time when churches are in trouble. We have numerous people, not making a political statement here, sort of a political statement here, that are concerned about the church now that the Liberals are in government. Whether it's legalization of marijuana or having to do with gay agendas or all those things. Issues about all that stuff. All of us have nervousness about that and what that will do to the church. Here's what I know is true. I know that the pastor in the fellowship who has the most edge, is maybe the least tolerant, is Mark Clark. Mark Clark started a church 4 years ago that's 5,000 people. That's what I know. I also know that their music would blow the doors off your church. It is loud, aggressive, edgy Christian music. There is no holds barred trying to find middle ground at all. This is what the word says, deal with it. I don't always agree with what he does. I don't always agree with the way he says it. I was listening to a person who told me they just gone to the church. He was talking about abortion, and his first thing in it was, if you've committed or had an abortion, you murdered a baby. It's his opening line. And it's just like, brutal statement. Then the rest of the sermon was, God's grace is enough for you. It's enough for all of us. But no holds barred. What do I think? I think significance attracts leaders. I think churches that are afraid to speak the truth are in trouble. But I also think that it's an illusion to believe that in Canadian culture you can't speak the truth and gather people. I think people are still attracted to something where you have to give your life to it, where it matters, where you have to actually say, this is worth my life. This is worth giving it to. So, important thing for leaders. Second fact, leaders influence people. So if you think that influencing people is manipulation, then you probably can't be a leader. So how many of you think leadership, that influencing people on purpose is manipulation? One. None of the rest of you think that's manipulation? Of course it's manipulation. You're trying to influence them on purpose. Is that not manipulating by definition?
I guess it just has a bad connotation.
So we like to avoid the word?
Yeah, when you say manipulation, it sounds like emotional abuse or something.
When I think I'm right, I don't think I'm manipulating.
So true. Right? So the corollary to that is that everybody influences people in every single interaction. The only question is how you influence them. So when I talk to somebody about Christ, am I trying to get them to see Jesus in a different way and give their life to Him to follow Him forever? Yep. Will I do almost anything to convince them of that? I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to tell the truth, but I'm going to tell them any way I can to get through, to break through with that story to them. And they're saying, well, you're just trying to get me, people will say this all the time, you're just trying to get me to follow Jesus. Well, yes, of course. Like, what do you think this conversation is for? It's overt manipulation, but nevertheless, I'm there to influence them, raw, point blank, no question. I want their eternity to be changed. Unabashed with it. And influence, if you're going to lead and you don't believe you're willing to influence people on purpose, you can't lead. It's the essence of it. We believe that God has called us to a vision. Your church believes God has called you to a vision. If Sean gets up and does a sermon and says, well, I don't want any of you to follow necessarily, that would be a bad sermon. If you believe God's called you to it, don't you want to influence people to fulfill that call? I hope you do, and I hope you're very intentional about it. So influence begins with what we believe about people. So when we start thinking about influencing people, sometimes we talk about it, we don't like the word manipulation because it feels negative. We don't like the word politics because it sounds negative. There's politics everywhere. Politics are neutral. Politics are influence of people. Period. That's what it is. The question is, what direction are you influencing them? Are you influencing them for good? Are you influencing them based on the truth of what Christ has taught? Are you influencing them based on just what you want and you want for your own power? That would be completely wrong. So it starts with what we believe about people. Most people, for example, and it's a little set of things in here, don't believe in themselves. They lack personal confidence. They don't believe in themselves. It holds them back. Most people have few, if any, who believe in them. And if you ask them about who believes in you as a person, most people in most environments will tell you very few people that have really struggled to answer that question. Most people know when somebody believes in them. And so when you start asking them who believed in you because it changed your life, and they start to give that list, well, this is a person who believed in me, and look how it made a difference in my life. And most people will do almost anything they can to embrace a leader's belief in them. I believe all those things about people. So I believe that if I'm trying to grow and develop people in a church, trying to influence them intentionally with the gospel of Jesus Christ to change their community and the lives of people for eternity, and I believe that God has called them to it and they can do something meaningfully with their life to do it, and I actually convey that in every conversation I have. So when somebody says, I can't do this, of course you can. What do you mean you can't do that? Have you trusted God in this? Have you explored it? Have you grown it? Have you developed in this? I believe you can do it. And if it's true when you're saying that, are you influencing them? Absolutely. Should you be influencing them? Absolutely. God created them. God loves them. God made them for something. We should be changing their view of themselves, their view of the world, their view of other people every day, every interaction we have with them. It's our goal. It's unabashed. I don't think we should be shy about it at all. Leaders influence people. It's what we want to do. So, some of the keys to influence. Well, one of them is that our influence with others doesn't extend to all areas. So, we have limited influence to them. So, direct quote from it, anytime you think you have influence, try ordering somebody else's dog. You don't. With influence comes responsibility. If you want to influence people, you have to accept the responsibility that comes with it. It's very important. And leadership is about influence, not about position or title. So you need to believe that deeply or you never become a leader. You cannot get confused between the concept of position or title and influence. That's why anybody and everybody is a leader in some capacity. We all influence people every single day in every single interaction. Every person you meet at work, every customer you encounter, every person who walks in the door of a church, you're influencing them. So if you go back to the previous slide and you think about what do we believe about people, somebody walks in the door of the church. If we believe is that the likelihood is this person who's walking in the door of our church doesn't have a lot of people who believe in them. Doesn't have a lot of people who believe that God made them significantly for something really remarkable. Person who came in doesn't believe that God could do something through them that will change the lives of others. And they walk in the door, and somebody comes up and loves them and cares about them and looks them in the eye and communicates to them. Does that change them at all? If they stick around and they come to know that Christ died for them because they're that important to God, does that change them at all? Of course it does. What about if they walk in the door and nobody talks to them? And they come and they sit here, and everybody else has their little groups of people they know and they've talked to all the time, and they get together after church and they start talking and they're having coffee in the little groups, and the person's standing there by that back chair feeling a little awkward, not sure who to talk to, not sure if anybody, they don't really have any friends, but everybody looks like they got friends, but they don't have any, and they go get a cup of coffee and hang out in the lobby for a little while, and maybe somebody says hello, it's a little awkward, then they walk away again. How do you think they feel when they walk out?
Rejected and isolated?
Yeah, do they feel more important?
They feel like nonsense clicky probably or something?
Yeah, about themselves. Do they feel, they might think that. Do they think that they're important? Do they think God believes in them, that Jesus died for them, that they matter? Or do they think less? My only point in that is when we start to think leadership, we sometimes think like this big-time hero leader who's running everything. No, every person who walks in the door needs somebody who leads enough to look at them and ask, what do I believe about people? What do I believe about what Jesus believes about people? And what am I going to do because of it? Because the person who goes to that person who stands there and makes a friend and talks like a friend and talks to them like they matter, instead of looking at their clock saying, okay, I'm talking to them because I'm supposed to do this after church, otherwise I'm a bad Christian, but when I finish my 2 minutes, I'm out of here going for lunch with my real friends, which is what we do. And they're not stupid. All I'm saying is leaders influence people. Every interaction is an opportunity to lead in one way or the other, and it's all about what we believe about people and what we believe about Christ. We just don't live it out. So, number 4. I've got like 20 minutes to do 6 more. This will be super great. Number 1, leads by example. Number 2, enables others to grow and develop. Number 3, attracts and influences people. 4, desires to know God and His Word. So here's the bottom line on this one. You should care about the Bible because it's God's Word to you. And if you're not taking anything in, then you're not being able to put anything out. You can't lead people where you haven't gone. You can't teach people what you haven't learned. And we can't know what God desires if we've never listened to him. Bottom line. So we talked about those earlier things today, about the difference between a natural leader and a spiritual leader. A spiritual leader listens for God's will, not just their own desire. If you don't spend any time in the Word of God, you don't know God's will. Don't pretend you are. Don't pretend you are, in any sense, able to lead other people to do it, because you don't know what God's saying. If it's not filling your heart on a regular basis, got nothing to say about it. That's what churches hopefully talk about that all the time. So we're moving on. Number 5, emphasizes prayer. So number 1, leads by example. Number 2, enables others to grow and develop. Number 3, attracts and influences people. Number 4, desires to know God and his word. Number 5, emphasizes prayer. So a quote from Andrew Murray in Christ in the School of Prayer. He says, reading a book about prayer, listening to lectures, and talking about it's very good. It won't teach you to pray. It's like leadership. You don't learn it in a classroom. You don't even learn it by reading a book. You get nothing without exercise, without practice. I might listen for a year to a professor of music play the most beautiful music, but it won't teach me to play an instrument. Have to pray. So I can't really say much more about that other than if you don't pray, you don't pray. And if you're not listening to God through his word, if you're not listening to God in prayer, as a Christian leader, you're nowhere. Again, that's at the foundation of any discipleship kind of process we ever develop in a church. God's word matters, prayer matters. And in fact, if you don't get those two, everything else we've talked about is irrelevant. If you don't get those two, you're never going to break away from your group of friends and talk to somebody else for the sole reason that they matter to God. And so you're going to speak to them not because they came in the door and don't know anybody, but you're going to speak to them because you actually believe they matter to God. And that's why you're having the conversation. So when you have it, you aren't having to force yourself to now have a conversation with somebody that you don't really want to talk to. You actually care about them. Why? Because they matter to God. And because you know the heart of God, and that's in you, they matter to you. So we talk about this stuff again in church all the time. The hardest thing, I think, in all of it is to get it out of our brain and into our heart, into the point where it becomes who we are. That when we go and we interact with people, whether it's at work or wherever, we're trying to think, I want to influence, I'm willing to lead, I'm willing to influence on purpose with the heart of God, with a servant perspective. And you do it over and over and over. And you're not going to get them if you don't spend time in the Word and you don't spend time praying. And it's really not the sole focus today. That would be like a pure discipleship focus. I would also say in Christian leadership, absolutely foundational. Any church I've ever been in, we do a process, including our regional board now actually, process of interviews for anybody who's getting on a board, and it's like question 1 and question 2. You spend time in the Word of God. The answer is no. It's like, thanks for coming. And then next year, let's talk again. Now, there is a follow-up to that, which is let's go have coffee and talk about why you don't, because I care about discipling that person, but for sure they're not going to lead a church. When we invite people into Immerse, we do an assessment. Did you have to do the assessment, Ryan?
I did the C2C one.
You did the C2C one. When we do an assessment, we do a 2-day assessment for people in Immerse. We have this conversation, frankly, okay, well, bottom line, honestly, we have a team that decides whether people get in or not. Some of our team have a more theoretical perspective than I do on some of it, and so they'll say, well, they've got like a 4-year window that we're going to train these people for, maybe even 5 years to get them where they need to go. I look at it, if a person's coming into Immerse to get a Master of Divinity to be a professional leader in the Church of Jesus Christ, and they don't come in with a devotional life that has some vibrancy to it, kick them out before they ever start. Save us all the pain. Like, goodbye, thanks for coming. No, well, this is a ridiculous idea. Why would you ever come in here and we accept you into a program to become a follower or a leader of other churches if this isn't in your heart to start with? Go get that straight and then come back to us. It's very basic. Okay, number 6, relates ministry to vision. The soul never thinks without a picture. That was Aristotle. For me, great theology textbook, which I use all the time. Well, there's 2 of them. One is Dilbert. The other one, one of them is Dilbert. The other one is Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland is a great human study in many different ways. So here's just a quote from it. You guys will probably know this. Cheshire Cat, would you please tell me which way I ought to go from here? Well, that depends a whole lot on where you want to go, said the cat. Doesn't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't much matter which way you go, said the cat. Well, so long as I get somewhere, said Alice as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you just walk long enough. It's a statement about vision, about direction. And it's a pretty common problem. So leaders are people who always connect ministry to vision. So when you're in a ministry of the church, you don't just think, I'm doing Sunday school. You don't think I'm doing small groups. You don't think I'm doing a worship service. You think, how do I connect the ministry I'm in to the vision that God has given this church as a whole? Leaders are connecting those dots all the time and trying to ask, how do my values matter? How do we make a difference in what we do? And trying to evaluate them. So with our staff, for example, we do a retreat once a year, and in that retreat we'll spend some time, and we have 5 primary values that we operate relative to churches in Fellowship Pacific. And so we'll have conversations, a full day of them, where we'll say, okay, come in, and before you get here, make your list under each of these values of things we did that contributed to those values, things we did that were not those values, that showed the opposite of that value. And then we'll sit and evaluate and say, okay, are we living out our values? Are we living out our values? Are we living out our values? Is that consistent? What's our vision? Are we doing it? Are we not doing it? Should be doing it all the time, because leaders are those, which is a term from Dennis and Nanis, leaders are those who create dangerously. They change the metabolism of an organization. They create the seeds of their own destruction. What that means is that you're always trying to recreate yourself in a better way. You're looking for how this can improve. You're not stuck on the status quo and holding on to that forever. They create new visions that inspire and ennoble while instilling the confidence to take the risks. And often failure today is failure to change. So change occurs all the time. It changes. It happens so rapidly. So again, even in a general planning kind of process, for our group of churches at least, we've moved from what would be a strategic planning in its traditional mode to a thing called adaptive planning, which uses a 1-year window instead of a 5 or 6 or 7 year window, just because change is occurring so fast. A 5-year window is just wasting our time to try and think in those terms. So we try and think of it from a different perspective. And leaders continually ask if the ministry we do is connected to the vision that we're pursuing. So, because if it does, it makes a difference and everybody knows it. So, for example, next slide here. Whose corporate vision is this? To give ordinary folk the chance to buy the same things as rich people. Whose is it? It's Walmart's. There you go. Okay, to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors. It's Nike. To make people happy. No. That's to kill people. That's different. So, that's where I had breakfast. I love their breakfast. So, to make people happy. Think about it. Whose is it? Disneyland. Okay, to solve unsolved problems innovatively. Hint, 3M. That's a big hint. To preserve and improve human life. Merck. Do you know who Merck is? Largest pharmaceutical company in the world. Merck they developed a radiation sickness drug after World War II. When there was radiation sickness in Japan, they went and gave it away because they believed that their statement was to preserve and improve human life. It wasn't to make drugs. And so if they had a drug that would solve a problem for people and they didn't use it, they were violating their own vision. So they gave it away after World War II to people around those. And Merck is now the largest pharmaceutical company in Japan.
Question mark on purpose.
It's big pharma, you know. I always have a bit of a question. What I also know that Merck did is they developed a drug for river blindness, which is a thing in Africa that people in particular areas of Africa, it's a parasite that occurs near rivers and it comes up and goes through and anyway blinds the people. They developed that, but in Africa today, as it has been for a long period of time, health, food, all those things are weapons of political weapons, and so they couldn't find anybody who would actually give it away or pay any company, or rather any country that would pay for it to be given to their people. So they went and gave it away, sent their own teams out on their version of corporate mission trips to just give away the drugs to people in these places. Why? Because their mission is to preserve and improve human life. When you start looking at that for corporations, it always makes me feel a little bit sick about the church. When they can spend millions and millions, and there's many, many stories of that. Next slide. So if you take 3M, for example, and there's again, 3M's one is what? We just said what it was. To solve problems innovatively. So here's some of the things they do internally to try and actually make their vision be reality. 15% rule. They have techies spend 15% of their time on their own projects of their own choosing and initiative. They're supposed to innovate things and pursue something they love for 15% of their time. They have a 25% rule where every division in 3M is expected to generate 25% of their annual sales from new products every 5 years. And in fact, they give some of them away. So they sell products that are over 5 years old that hasn't been innovated on in some sense on a regular basis. They have a Golden Step Award for those who develop new business ventures within 3M. And so they give an award every year for that. They have Genesis grants where they have internal grants to researchers within 3M during their 15% rule, where they can get a $50,000 grant to study something new. All of which is because they're taking their vision statement seriously and doing something about it. And so when I'm saying relates ministry to vision, I'm saying churches ought to be doing the same thing. We ought to be saying, what's our ministry? What's our vision? How does it work out in ministry? What does our culture create? What do we do? All of the things that we're talking about here in leadership are not one thing separate from another. So I'm saying 10 qualities of a leader, but they integrate. They're all part of what leadership is. And we as churches need to start looking at it, be more intentional, brighter about what we do, and ask, okay, how do we develop this in a real way? We do ridiculous things. Our staff, every single staff meeting for us, one person gets up and has to do our vision, write it on a whiteboard that we have in our office, tell us the vision and tell us the newest stories you have of how God is doing that. Why? Just because I'm so convinced that vision leaks. That the moment you stop talking about it, you stop doing it. The moment you stop saying, this is what we're here for, this is how it works out, this is how we're living out our values, the minute you stop doing it, you go off on rabbit trails all over away from it. But really critical for leaders. So here's another one. Whose values are these? Next slide. Elevation of Japanese culture and national status, being a pioneer, not following others, doing the impossible, encouraging individual ability and creativity. What company is that?
Mitsubishi.
It's a guess. Good guess. It's actually Sony. I don't know if they're still doing it, the being a pioneer. I think they're falling behind on the pioneer front. 2 Koreans. Next slide. Whose values are these? No cynicism, nurturing and promulgation of wholesome American values, creativity, dreams, imagination, fanatical attention to consistency and detail, preservation of the magic. Disney. Easy. Next slide. Whose values are these? Service to the customer above all else, hard work, individual productivity, never be satisfied, excellence and reputation, being part of something special. You probably won't know. It's a U.S. company. Nordstrom's, known best of all for service and service stories. We're going to skip this next thing because it's really not about vision per se. But here's your vision. Mountainside Community Church exists to advance the kingdom of God by vitally connecting people to Jesus Christ. Your actual values in that, biblically anchored, culturally relevant, missionally motivated, relationally focused, discipleship-based, spiritually attuned, serving together. Question for you in any one of your ministries, if you're in leadership in the church, is do you do it? Like, do you actually ever go back to those and look at them and ask, do they matter? Do they change what we do? Do they affect what we do? Can we go through our ministries one by one and asking ourselves, that's actually what we're doing? And what are we doing that's not that? What are we doing that is that? How do we build into that? Because if you stop looking at it and doing it, you stop doing it. If it's just on your website, and probably one of the big issues with churches today and leaders today is that we get vision statements that are nothing but paper we stick on a wall or we put it over our door on the exit. I see it in church after church. It's a banner outside. You know, and when we do our church consultations, Mary maybe remembers this. We do our church consultations, we go into churches, vision is one of the things we talk about with them. And we ask them, what's the vision of the church? Oh, we don't know. Can any of you quote the vision of our church? If you even tell us without the right words what the vision are, no, I can't do it. And it's on the front of their bulletin every Sunday. And it's on a banner on the back of their room that they're sitting in while we're doing the focus group. It's like, do any of you know your vision? No. You know it's on your wall, right? Like right here. You know it's on your bulletin every single week. Oh yeah, I remember that's on the front. Yeah, do you remember what it is? No.
Isn't that our mission, though, not our vision?
Well, that could be. We won't get into mission vision conversations. other than say mission is your big unchanging concept. Vision is the unique application of that mission to your local setting. So you want to understand the difference. Vision is a picture of the preferred future. But again, whole other conversation for another time. Okay, leaders. Number 7. Number 1L is what? Leads by example. 2, attracts and influences people. 3, enables others to grow and develop. 4, desires to know God and His Word. Don't forget it. 5, emphasizes prayer. 6, we just did it. Relates ministry to vision. Here's the key for this, because it took me a long time to get this. It spells leadership. See, there you go, right there. There's like a trick for it. Mnemonic device for qualities of a leader. So, servant attitude. We talked about that today. Can I skip this? Did you get this earlier? Okay, we're going to skip it. You could look at it yourself, because it makes a difference in what we do. But since I've got 3 minutes. Hungry to learn. Face the facts that many today are notoriously careless. Oh, where am I on there? Face the fact that many today are notoriously careless in their living. The attitude finds its way into the church. We have liberty, we have money, we live in comparative luxury. As a result, discipline practically has disappeared. What would a violin sound like if the strings in the musician's instrument were hanging looses, and not stretched tight, not disciplined? A.W. Tozer's statement about lifetime learning and the necessity of it. So, blast of the obvious is that wise leaders are committed to learning. I hope that's obvious. You're here, so obviously it matters to you. I don't know how many leaders you have in your church, but I would look around and ask, is it true for everybody else? Hopefully it is. Second blast of the obvious, a commitment to learning is a commitment to godliness. So when you're talking about learning and growing, it's not an anti-spiritual separate thing. It's part of our spiritual life. Growth in our spiritual life is also commitment to learning, not just the directly spiritual things, although those certainly matter, but also the things in life, because we shouldn't be separating spiritual and unspiritual. We shouldn't be looking at what we do in church is spiritual, what we do outside the church is not spiritual. We shouldn't be saying when we come in and we're in a worship service, it's a spiritual experience, but when I go to work on Monday, it's not. Because they all are. They're all part of influence. They're all part of attracting people. They're all part of making a difference for Christ. They're all part of seeing our life live with integrity in front of people on a regular basis and being learners. So we got to be consistent in that throughout the process. So how does learning occur? Well, obviously all kinds of ways, and that's in the next slide here, Matt. And you can look at this yourself, but wide range of reading. Reading is really important. Listening to younger and older. It was good to see Paul actually doing seminar on technology and picking apart your time management, or however that was framed. Did he pick apart your time management? Did he really? He was cruel. Yeah, if he was in Mary's seminar, he would have found out that he's green and cruel. Green means cruel. That's what we learned in that seminar. So you actually have to listen, and we really do need to. There's a book called Reverse Mentoring, which is an interesting book. It's not like a scintillating read, but it's an interesting read about the fact that people today, older people like me, had better be learning from younger people, because younger people are living with a different mindset altogether in a digital world, which has radically shifted the way all of culture thinks. And that if we don't understand it, we're not learning it. So the learning part takes place both ways. There's the wisdom of being older, and there's also the wisdom of being younger, which is a slightly different kind of wisdom. But I think we have to be learning from each other now, maybe more so than ever, because of the pace of change, that kind of thing. There's also experience. There's stealing ideas. There's being in the right environment, by which I mean our learning should take place where we're neither under-challenged nor over-challenged. So if you're under-challenged, you tune out. If you're over-challenged, you also tune out, but for a very different reason. And so trying to create that in a church world where you're challenging leaders to grow and learn on a regular basis, you're trying to find that line, and it's pretty much a dance to try and get that right line where they're not over-challenged, they're not under-challenged. They feel like they need to grow to learn it, but it's not so much that they drown. And somewhere in there is a line that we're looking for. You need to experience both the desert and the garden. Really important, I think, in spiritual learning is that it isn't just the garden. And our churches which love good times are not as keen on the hard times. and we run away from them. And even in churches, people do this all the time. Today, they vote with their feet, and so they leave. And when they leave is, say there's a conflict, they leave. Say there's not enough money, they leave. Say they're building a building and they don't want to build a building, they leave. Today, people don't stay and have a conflict. Today, people just leave church. They stop coming all together, they go to another one that's not going to ask them or challenge them in the same way. And somewhere as leaders, we have to start to grow to the point of teaching people that we learn in the garden and we learn in the desert. Sometimes the hardest times are the best times. So, and just at a very basic level, I use building because it's tangible, but I'm not on a building kick here, although I talked about that earlier too. When we did a church building, we did 2 building things. For me, they were the most fun times in church, because I really believe you cannot outgive God. And in my own experience of that is so tangible and real. It isn't like some airy-fairy spiritual conversation. In the most tangible of ways, you cannot outgive God. And you cannot learn to have faith until you have to, until it hurts. And so even like regular tithing, for me, I've never not done it. I grew up in a house where I was taught to do it. I've always done that. So there's really no pain involved, frankly. It's just been normal. I've never known another world, so it's average. When you start doing a building or something like that, or something, or a project, or a trip to Mexico, name your project, doesn't matter, where you say to people, okay, we want you to give, and give way beyond, and give not out of your regular tithe, and trust God that if it's what God's called us to, God will supply it. Best of times. Absolutely the best of times. Because you have to trust God, stretch into something you wouldn't stretch, and it's hard for you to do it, and you feel nervous, and you don't think you can. My experience, you cannot outgive God, ever. Like, ever. I remember one year we were doing a thing, and my wife and I decided we had Canucks seasons tickets. Actually, no, it was Lions seasons tickets. Later we had Canucks seasons tickets. And we had Lions seasons tickets, which I would never do now. Anyway, and we decided, okay, we're not going to do that, and we'll give that money to this. And, you know, that's the things that we're going to choose to sacrifice to pay for this thing. What are we going to give up to do this? We went to every single game that year. Like, everyone. Somebody gave us tickets to everything. Like, one of different people, different places. We didn't tell anybody we'd ever done it. I just end the year, and I think, of course, like, in the most tangible of ways, you cannot outgive God. Because God delights in giving good gifts to his children, and money is not an issue. Money is an issue for us. It's not an issue for God. But if we never push people to challenge, and money in our culture is such a big deal, if we can't sacrifice there, we probably can't sacrifice anywhere. We're just kidding ourselves. And so to push our churches to give to something that matters, whatever that is, it doesn't really matter what the project is, but to give beyond ourselves for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of people, for the sake, I think it's a great thing, growth-wise. Anyway, learning. It's one way to learn. Got to be hungry to learn. Skip all that stuff. Number 9, integrity. Max Dupree in Leading Without Power says, for all the trust that exists in our world, it's not an inevitable result of organizing ourselves into groups. Even in nonprofits, where we might expect it to blossom more readily, trust must be cultivated. Leaders quickly learn that followers set standards to be met before trust is granted. Perhaps that's a reason that trust is so precious in organizations. It cannot be bought or commanded, inherited or enforced. To maintain it, leaders must continually earn it. A position of trust is not a lifetime certainty. Or as Henry Mitchell said, advice to beginning leaders, don't use your authority till you've got it. It's a really good advice. Piece of advice. Don't use your authority until you have it, and you earn it, you're not given it. And so when you start talking about integrity, and whoever said integrity earlier, who said integrity is characteristic? Somebody did. Kevin did. Kevin's telling the truth. He didn't say it. So integrity is really, really important. And Dilbert, which is the next slide, but we aren't going to spend time. You have to just look it up in your book. Dilbert's awesome. Anything you can think of that's cynical, Dilbert's got it. So it's pretty great, but we're moving past it because we don't have time for it. So next slide. Understand that we're in a time of real growing integrity deficit for all kinds of reasons that we're not even going to talk about. Move on to the next slide. But integrity has huge, huge value. It builds trust, it allows for influence, it demands our best, since integrity requires consistency between words and actions. It assumes that we do what we're asking people to do. That means we keep our promises. It means we fulfill our responsibilities. It means we maintain our our confidences with people, all those kinds of things. And it's difficult to do, and it comes into conflict on a regular basis, but integrity is such a big deal. Such a big deal. I can't even begin to say how big a deal it is to actually, particularly in the church, to say what you say is what you do, you live it out with consistency in your life, and you tell the truth. All the time, regularly. And with that, I would say integrity today demands some vulnerability and some transparency for that. So John says, the man who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anybody obeys his words, God's love is made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus lived, or as Jesus walked. God expects us of it. It's completely critical. I really don't know what to say about it other than jump up and down and say, if you don't live it and do that and behave it, it doesn't mean you don't ever make mistakes. It just means that when you make them, you say, people, I made a mistake. That's it. But telling the truth becomes really important. Goes to the greeniness of me that Mary was talking about. For me, that's like super easy. It's like, this is what I think is true, and I don't care if you hate me. It's like, I just don't worry about it. As far as that goes. Integrity demands courage, I think, in today's culture, because it demands that you start to tell the truth. Now, you want to tell the truth in love, absolutely, but you still have to tell the truth. And in church after church that I go to, they get into this veil of we can't tell people what's going on because it'll offend them or bother them, or if they hear this, they'll be upset. It's like, why? Why would we try to create this culture where not telling the truth or not telling the full truth becomes what we do? Now, there are some cases, of course, because of the privacy for individual people, we're not going to say stuff. But in general, we want to be as transparent as we can be in every way we can be. So Reality 101, move on to the, oh, you don't even have it on here. Okay, this slide's not in here. Is integrity should reveal a gentleness to people, but understand it's also rock hard at the core. So integrity is a difficult thing. One of the things, again, personal mission statement for me, and I've mentioned this, it's God's ever-changing workmanship in which, and I had, when I first wrote this thing, which was a long time ago now, it was to be a man of truth and principle, was one of the little statements in my personal mission statement. I found that that's rock hard, like rock hard. If you say that I will always be a man of truth and principle, it sounds good, it's really brutal in marriage. Like really brutal in marriage. So if my wife says, do you like my dress? No, that's the ugliest dress ever. See, that doesn't go well. Do I look fat today? Oh, yes. See, not good. So I've added to that because of the wisdom of experience, Mary. In spite of being a person who tends to be analytical and fairly straightforward, it's now to be a man of truth and principle, constrained by the love of God. So that's my out in all circumstances where marriage is concerned. Sometimes it's best not to answer. I'm trying to teach my son who's getting married how to survive his marriage. It's yes, dear, no, dear, and is like the all-purpose statement. It's like, what do you think of that? That's it. And you try to change the way you say it, like, Like there's different ways of saying that can interpret different things, but you can't be called on the words later on. So very important in marriage to learn all those critical things. But anyway, integrity demands understanding and applying boundaries to your life. And it's very important to get that. I think Mary and I, we actually talked about that just a little bit upstairs. You need to know what you will and won't say. You need to know when you will and won't say it. You need to know what you will and will not do. And you need to know what you can and cannot control. Integrity demands all of those things. Now that sounds like you can waft over that. That is among the most difficult things we ever do in leadership, is know what we can't control and put boundaries around our life, because we can't survive it if we can't understand it and have some integrity in that, to say, look, you know what? I can tell the truth to people, but I can't control the outcome. I have to be able to go home. For a person in leadership who wants to behave with integrity, you have to be able to let go. And what I mean by that is put boundaries around what you can and can't do. I can speak the truth in love. I can't determine the outcome. And if I worry about it in leadership, in Christian leadership in particular, about what happens with every person I talk to, it will eat me up and kill me. Now, the truth is, your personality does make a difference. So, to use the language that Mary was talking about, a blue person was the person, who were all the blue people here? Yeah, so a person who's blue cares more about the feelings of others. That's their natural personality bent. It's way harder to create those boundaries and actually walk away and go home. I go home and go to sleep. It's like, then people, I'll have this with people in marriage. They'll come in for marriage counseling and tell me they had an affair, they're going to get divided, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, here's what you need to do. Are you going to do it? Well, no. And they'll say, no. Okay then, have a good life. And they'll say, what are you doing? Going home. Like, why? Because I can't fix it. I can't fix it. Do you understand you can't fix it? Somewhere deep down, now it's easier for me because that's my personality, but for any of us, if we're going to be in leadership and we don't understand that, that's an issue of integrity. Speak the truth and understand the boundaries that go with it. There are things we cannot control, and if we start to think we can and we own what God alone can do, it will kill us. It will eat us up. And everybody else's crisis will become your crisis. So people in a marriage scenario who would come in and they'd phone me quite regularly, because it happens for pastor life all the time on a day off, because it's like a test of love. Like, if you come and serve me on the day off, then you love me more. And they'd phone me and they'd say, you know, we're in a crisis and our marriage is going to break up. We need to talk to you tonight. Here's my standard answer. Well, here's what's true. What's true is your marriage is not in a crisis today. Your marriage has been in a crisis at a minimum months before this, possibly years before this. Here's the other truth. It's not going to be fixed by tomorrow. Get an appointment. Because it's not going to be fixed by tomorrow. All I'm saying, I know that sounds harsh, and I don't mean it, and it isn't really that I don't care. It's just, you know, experience does teach you over 30 years of this. I can't fix it. I can give direction, I can help them, but somewhere truth has to come into it, and that's the integrity of knowing what you can and can't do, what you will and won't say, what you're willing to say, what you're not willing to say, what you can control and you can't control. Because we take it on ourselves as leadership to be God, to fix everybody else's problem, and we can't do it. God can do it. We can point them the way, but the truth is, marriage is an example, you know, the law of the harvest, which Jesus taught, comes into play, which is that if you sow weeds for 5 years, you are not getting rid of them in one day. It will take you 5 years to get rid of them. If you're committed to it and you want to work at it, I can help you. I can keep having the conversation with you, but you're going to be weeding for 5 years, at a minimum. Because once you get the weeds out of your garden, you think more weeds aren't coming? You think there aren't more seeds in the ground? Of course they're there. So we pretend as leaders sometimes that we can do things we can't do, and people come in and we give them the answer they want to hear, and we think that we've helped them when we did it. And we haven't. We were just cowards. We just had no courage. We were just willing to let our family, our life go down the tubes for the sake of theirs. And in the process, by the way, we didn't help them. Because we lied to them. We gave them false hope that doesn't exist. Now, what is true is God can transform overnight. What is true is that God can save that marriage. And I could give you story after story. We had one person who was on a board, turned out his wife had had 10 affairs. 10. And it went back to an issue where she'd been abused as a child and never told, and there's a whole story that you can guess that would go with that kind of thing. They're happy together. God is doing remarkable things in their life. They're working in Celebrate Recovery, actually in a sexual addictions group, working with them. Remarkable story of how God worked, but it took a long time to weed that. But they were committed to it. If they're committed to it, you can help them, and God can work in them, and God does miraculous, miraculous things. But never get confused in leadership in thinking that integrity means you tell people what they want to hear, or that integrity means that it's easy and they like you because you behave with it. It isn't. It's rock hard. And it generates lots of enemies in the process. So, okay, finally, last thing, perseverance. 10 qualities of a leader. Persevere. Why? Well, because the Bible tells you to. There's one. All kinds of verses. You can look it up in here. Number 2, reason to persevere. It's one of the things that's motivating. Things that require perseverance are more motivating than things that don't. So an autotelic device or all autotelic activity that is a thing that's internally, intrinsically motivating tend to be high challenge activities. So leaders have to believe that they're tasked to use all their skills and abilities. They look for opportunities to solve problems, discovery, explore new areas. Leaders, that is, leaders don't like maintenance. So they have to persevere and see the vision fulfilled. And so if we're going to be leaders in the Church of Jesus Christ, we've got to do it. So the book that's had the most meaningful title to me in my personal ministry experience by far, the book itself was average. The title was awesome. It's a book by Eugene Peterson called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And I've gone back, not to the book, but to the title of the book, over and over and over and over, to say to myself, no, long obedience in the same direction, long obedience in the same direction, long obedience in the same direction. And part of that, and you can agree or disagree, and I know some of you truthfully would just plain disagree, it's discover who you are, discover the gifts that God's given you, use them for Him, and to the best of your ability, personality allowing, don't take things that aren't yours. You've got to persevere and believe God called you to this, to be this person, to behave consistently with that person that God made you to be, and you keep after it, and you keep after it, and you keep after it, and you keep after it. Through the deserts, through the gardens, through the good times, through the hard times, you just keep going. And you buy into Paul's thing that I will finish the race. I will complete the task that God has given me. At the end of the day, you ask yourself, what is it that I'm doing this for? What is it you're doing this for? So I have this vision. It's a thing, old Stephen Covey, which is a Mormon thing, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is an old, I don't know what that would be now, 30-year-old book, something like that. He talks about if you envisioned your own funeral and your own tombstone, what would be on your tombstone? And for me, at one point, there's a whole list of things. That's what became the mission statement for me, is what are the things I would love to have somebody, if they were standing and I was listening to my own funeral, what would I want them to say? And different things affect you on it. So one of them has to do with family and what I want them to think about me and what they would say about me at my funeral. Heavily influenced by the fact that I never knew my biological father. All part of self-awareness of standing at his graveside and realizing it mattered to me. I'd like it to matter to my kids. Part of it is be a man of truth and principle, now constrained by the love of God. Some of it is, okay, well, and I've thought about it, and I thought, okay, what would be true? If somebody stands up at my funeral and they said, you know what? The one thing I always knew with David is I went and asked him a question, he would tell me the truth, whether I wanted to hear it or not. Thought, am I okay with that? Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'll be okay with it. Somebody else says, yeah, but he did it, and sometimes it didn't feel good and I didn't like it. Am I okay with that? Yeah, I'm okay with that. I can live with that. And so I really do actually think that. So when I think of these 10 things, and I've mentioned when I started, I've been thinking about them a long time, but I think of them in terms of that, the end of the day. Someday there's going to be a funeral. Someday my family's going to be standing there. What do I want my kids to hear people say? If people stood up and told the truth about me, what would they say? And I think if they say that, and they say that, and they say that, that would be great. I'm okay for that. I can live for that. So my encouragement to you in leadership is think about that when you think of qualities of a leader and ask, who do you want to be? Who are you prepared to live to be? And sometimes it just helps to step back and ask, if it's your kids and they're talking about you at your funeral, or they're hearing other people talk about, what do you want them to hear? And hopefully that's what God would be saying as well. So let's pray. Thanks for the day, by the way. Father, thank you for the opportunity to lead. So much we could say about it. So much we could debate about it, about what's right and wrong, the right way to do it, the wrong way to do it, all those sorts of things. But at the end of all that conversation comes the fact that you've called us to it. Your Son gave himself for us and calls us to give our life for something that matters, which is to draw people to you. And we want desperately to do that. We want our leadership to be part of it. Father, I pray for this church that the people that are in this room and those who couldn't be here today will become leaders that exemplify the heart of your Son. Leaders who are courageous. Leaders who give their life to helping others connect with Jesus. Leaders who live it out every day, whether it's in a church or outside. So use them, teach them, help them to grow for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of your name. We ask in your name. Amen.